Hidden amongst the trees by the mansion house of Boomhall lies an ancient stone. Legend has it that it was once part of the great boom thrown across the River Foyle during the siege of Derry in 1689. The floating barrier of fir beams, chained and roped together, was anchored to the riverbank by a large stone. The barrier was designed to prevent Williamite supply ships from relieving the starving inhabitants of the city from the besieging Jacobite army. Shattered into 4 pieces, the stone has a story to tell about its part in the downfall of King James II, the rise of William and Mary, and of how power shifted from the monarchy to Parliament, giving birth to parliamentary democracy in the British Isles. The road towards the siege of Derry began when James II lost his English throne in 1688. James was a Catholic monarch ruling a Protestant country in a time of religious turmoil in Europe. The Protestant majority in Scotland and England were alarmed when James defied Parliament and the penal laws by placing Catholics in high positions in the army, navy and courts. Tensions reached a crisis point when James's wife gave birth to a Catholic son who would take precedence in succession to the throne over James's 2 Protestant daughters. Fearing the establishment of a Catholic dynasty in Britain, a group of English nobles, bishops and military leaders invited William of Orange, the elected Protestant leader of key Dutch provinces, to intervene and accept the English crown. In November 1688, William of Orange landed in England with a large army, prompting the collapse of James II's support and his eventual flight to France. He was warmly received by his cousin, King Louis XIV, who offered him protection and support. With William now in control of the English navy, Louis XIV's expansionist ambitions in Europe were threatened by the newfound strength of his primary European opponent, William of Orange. During his 72-year reign, Louis XIV persecuted Protestants for practicing their faith, causing many to flee the country. Louis aspired to dominate Europe as an absolute monarch and aimed to expand the borders of France to secure his eastern and southern borders. He created the most powerful standing army and navy that Europe had ever seen. In 1686, neighbouring territories, including William's Dutch Republic, formed the League of Augsburg to resist Louis's ambitions. To distract William from the war on the continent, Louis sent James and a French army to Kinsale in March of 1689. The intention was to move through Ireland and Scotland, recruiting a larger army, and then to march on London to depose William and Mary. The largely Protestant population in Ulster feared the arrival of a French-led army accustomed to persecuting Protestants, so the apprentice boys of Derry closed the gates of the city to James's Redshanks in December 1688, and the defenders shot at the king himself as he approached the city walls in April 1689. Realising he'd have to besiege the city, James needed to ensure that Williamite ships couldn't sail up the River Foyle to break his siege. Ships could sail freely into the Foyle because the French navy was concentrated in the English Channel. The lack of naval support also prevented James from using the Irish sea route from Kinsale to ship the extra guns needed to breach the walls. This rendered the Jacobite bombardment of the city inconclusive during the first few weeks of the siege and gave the Williamite fleet time to sail from England. As an improvisation to obstruct any Williamite ships that entered the Foyle, a makeshift floating boom, cobbled together from foraged ropes, chains and wooden beams, was constructed as a barrier across the river at Boomhall. A large boomstone helped to anchor it to the shore. However, James overestimated the strength of the boom and made the fatal strategic error of ignoring advice from his French engineers to make a second barrier of sunken ships and debris in the narrow straits of Culmore. Despite its doubtful strength, the boom had a profound psychological effect upon the Williamite navy when it first arrived in the Foyle. The head of the fleet, Captain Kirk, postponed relief of the city by 47 days for fear of the boom, a delay which potentially caused the death of a further 1,700 people. 103 days into the siege, the defenders within the city were despairing and sent a young boy through enemy lines with a letter for Captain Kirk, explaining that the city would have to surrender within a day if the fleet didn't come to their assistance. The next day, the frigate Dartmouth began the attempt by providing covering fire at Culmore Fort, allowing the Mountjoy and the Phoenix to slip down the river to Boomhall, where the Mountjoy attempted to break the boom by ramming it. The ship recoiled back and became stuck in the mud by the riverbank. Although the Mountjoy had snapped the iron parts of the boom, it was up to the axemen in the longboat to cut away the remaining wooden parts. Jacobites fired from the shoreline at close quarters with cannon and musket fire, and a cavalry charge attempted to cross the muddy east bank towards the floundering Mountjoy was met by 3 cannon volley from the ship. The recoil from firing the cannons loosened the Mountjoy from the mud, and with the axemen having successfully severed the boom, the river was now open, allowing the ships to sail freely into the city with enough food, guns and ammunition to end the siege of Derry. This event was the decisive turning point that ended any chance of Louis and James deposing William through an Irish war. Newly secure, William accepted his role as a constitutional monarch, subject to the will of Parliament and free elections. The British Isles combined forces with the League of Augsburg, creating the Grand Alliance, relegating the French Navy to the second largest navy in Europe and significantly reducing Louis's ability to dominate the continent. The making of the boom attached to this stone was an act of desperation by an old regime of absolute monarchs resisting change and clinging to power. The breaking of the boom marked the beginning of a new age of revolution, parliamentary democracy, and the end of absolute monarchy in Britain.